2019's Harriet marks the first feature film about Harriet Tubman. While great care was taken to present the real Tubman, a few creative liberties were taken to better illustrate her world and the values she stood for. Here are some of the things Harriet got wrong about Harriet Tubman's life. When Harriet opens, we are introduced to a young woman named Minty, short for Araminta Ross. Fiery and fearless, it quickly becomes apparent that this is the woman who will become known as Harriet Tubman. Minty's first major action in the film is escaping her master's plantation. When she ends the harrowing journey, arriving in Pennsylvania as a free woman, she marks the occasion by adopting a new name, Harriet, the first name of her mother, and Tubman, the surname of her husband whom she had to leave behind. The film uses this scene to emphasize Tubman's commitment to her family, and also introduce audiences to William Still, a black abolitionist and colleague of Tubman's who records the name change. This was a real, important ritual carried out by many former slaves, later being revived by activists such as Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X.
Would you like to pick a new name? To mark your freedom, most ex-slaves do any name you want.
But the powerful scene never actually happened. While Tubman and Still did really work together, their relationship likely began after Tubman had become a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Additionally, the Harriet Tubman Historical Society says Minty was already going by Harriet Tubman by the time she escaped to freedom. Little is known about the real John Tubman or his 5-year marriage to Harriet, but it's not likely that he was as supportive of the real Harriet as the fictional version is. In an early biography about Harriet, written by Sarah Hopkins Bradford, John is painted in a less than flattering light, condescending and dismissive of his wife, even personally capturing her during an attempted escape. Later biographers, like Katie Clifford Larson, have challenged Bradford's depiction, claiming him instead to be a love-struck and devoted man who may have even been saving to buy his wife's freedom. But whoever John was, the truth is he was never supportive of Harriet's decision to escape, and in fact threatened to turn Harriet in, likely fearful his involvement in her escape would jeopardize his own freedom and livelihood. Family meant everything to Harriet Tubman, who was willing to risk so much to ensure their comfort and safety. But in Harriet, the real history has been altered to direct her affections more toward her husband John. After arriving in Pennsylvania, Tubman lamented that there was no one to welcome her to the land of freedom, with her family remaining in captivity in Maryland. In Harriet, she specifically yearns for her husband and is inspired to become a conductor on the Underground Railroad to go back and get him. But the Harriet Tubman Historical Society says her first return was actually to save her niece and her niece's 2 children from being sold further south. Tubman's first rescue was a resounding success and fortified her determination to free more and more people. By the time Harriet conducted her last mission, at the onset of the Civil War, nearly all of her family had been successfully freed. Among writer-director Casey Lemon's goals in creating Harriet was a desire to fully realize the less considered elements of the world in which Harriet Tubman lived. One such element that is well known to historians but not always addressed in films is the degree to which slavery contributed to the livelihood of individual families. Not long into Harriet, we learned that the Brodess estate is in great financial trouble, and that the family must weigh the option of selling some of their slaves or risk losing their property altogether. When he inherits the estate from his late father, Gideon Brodess makes the decision to sell Minty for extra money. The plot line develops Minty and Gideon's relationship and introduces the cat-and-mouse narrative that is constant in Tubman's life. But while the Brodess financial woes were reportedly real, there's no reason to believe that Tubman was tipped off, let alone directly told about the family's plan to sell her further south. After the death of her owner, Edward Brodess made it clear that her life would once again most likely be upset by change, Tubman would commit herself to escape, altering the course of her life as well as that of American history. At the age of 12, while intervening in a conflict between a slave and their master, Tubman was struck in the skull with a weight, fracturing her skull and giving her permanent brain damage. A deeply religious person, when Tubman began experiencing hallucinations as a result of her injury, she attributed them to God, interpreting them as warnings. In Harriet, Tubman's visions are treated as a completely real ability, a gift of supernatural foresight which she uses to evade slave catchers and plot her rescue missions. In reality, Tubman's injury probably did more harm than good, and certainly wasn't what carried her along on her many dangerous journeys. According to the Harriet Tubman Historical Society, once she was old enough to work, Tubman did everything in her power to avoid domestic chores and being around white women. Working outside in the fields was harsh and labor-intensive, but in her years spent outdoors, Tubman developed an intimate connection with the natural world. The Brodus family also frequently lent and rented their slaves out to neighbors and paying strangers within the area, further expanding Tubman's awareness of the topography of Maryland. Contemporaries of Tubman, as well as present-day historians, often marvel at the immense feats Tubman carried out, first by finding her own way to freedom, and then by aiding the escape of many others. But while Tubman herself would undoubtedly claim her abilities were aided by her celestial visions, her knowledge and instincts were probably much more helpful in her long and amazing career as an Underground Railroad conductor. While Harriet and her mother were slaves for the Brodus family in real time, there is no record of the family having a child by the name of Gideon. Many other facts about the family, from the patriarch's death to their eventual decline in status and wealth necessitating them to sell off their slaves, starting with Harriet's sisters, are true, though no figure in the family matters to the film more than the fictionalized Gideon.
Whoa, easy now. You can come on back. I won't hurt you bad.
Gideon is arguably the film's avatar for the sins of slavery distilled into one person. He is horrible to Harriet and her family. An early scene shows Gideon sees Harriet as nothing more than a piece of property, comparing her to owning a pig. Once Harriet escapes, it is Gideon who pursues her endlessly, obsessed with salvaging what is, in his mind, rightfully his. Like many of the characters created for the film, Gideon serves an important purpose. He pushes Harriet's story along and gives more focus to her story, which in reality was broader and more complicated than the movie suggests. In the film, William Still takes Harriet directly from the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society to the home of Marie Buchanan. While she runs a house for newly freed women like Harriet, Marie herself was born and raised a free woman in Philadelphia. As such, Marie is a successful business owner. The home she operates provides shelter to those looking for a new life, but she also helps them find paying jobs and helps to create a community for those braving the new world alone. While screenwriter Gregory Allen Howard says it's highly likely that women like Marie Buchanan existed, and may have even helped runaway slaves like Harriet, the Marie Buchanan character and the interactions she has with Harriet are entirely fictionalized. In reality, little is known about how Tubman lived once she arrived in Pennsylvania. Much of her history revolves around her journey and experiences with the Underground Railroad, but not where she lived or who exactly helped her when she first reached freedom. It's likely Marie Buchanan is a cipher for someone who may have existed and been able to help Tubman, alone and afraid, find her footing. Marie is everything Harriet wants to be: poised, confident, and very sure that no person should ever belong to anyone but themselves. Marie's support helps validate Harriet's decision to go back to Maryland, and Marie's gun gives her the means to do so with some protection. Regardless of its accuracy, it's an effective storytelling choice that helps flesh out the world around Harriet while giving her a worthy ally. In the film, Harriet's first trip back to the farm sees her freeing not only her own brothers, but several others who have heard of her return and are eager to seek freedom themselves. In total, Harriet escorts 9 people back to Pennsylvania, but not without getting noticed along the way. Gideon, furious at the thought of losing even more slaves, hires a local bounty hunter named Bigger Long, a black man who hunts and captures runaway slaves for a hefty fee. While Slate reports it's been widely speculated that black bounty hunters like Bigger Long likely existed, there's no historical record of anyone by that name operating in Maryland at the time of Tubman's escape. Bounty hunters like Bigger Long, often referred to as slave catchers, were often simply mercenaries hired by wealthy slave owners to reclaim what was seen as stolen property whenever a slave would run away. At various points in history, these figures were actually law enforcement officials whose official duties included tracking and returning fugitive slaves. In the film, Bigger Long is depicted as using a wolf-like dog to help track the slaves. In reality, many mercenaries used bloodhounds and other highly trained dogs in their own pursuits. There are some records that seem to indicate that black headhunters like Bigger Long may have existed in Ohio and Pennsylvania, but the names are few and far between. By the time the Fugitive Slave Act is passed in the film, Harriet has already successfully completed so many trips back and forth between Maryland and Pennsylvania that she's become one of the most successful conductors the Underground Railroad has ever seen. She's so effective, she's even earned a reputation. Posters all over the South search for the man named Moses, the one setting all of the slaves free. While it makes for an impressive movie montage, in reality, the Harriet Tubman Historical Society says she would have only completed 1, maybe 2 trips before the Fugitive Slave Act was enacted in 1850. As shown in the film, the biggest impact of the act was the distance slaves would have to travel in order to obtain freedom. Prior to its passing, slaves only needed to reach states where slavery was already abolished, such as the safe haven that was Pennsylvania.
Getting frustrated with the amount of runaways, federal judges, marshals, and slave catchers are working together. Even Congress is threatening to pass laws to appease the South.
The Fugitive Slave Act was also known as the Compromise of 1850, as it sought to appease the slave owners of the South by allowing them to recapture people who fled their custody no matter where in the U.S. they may have ended up. As a result, those seeking asylum were forced to push further north, all the way to Canada. This extended Tubman's journey by hundreds of miles, increasing the risk of capture, but also increasing the likelihood that something else could go wrong on the journey. Slaves navigated a complicated landscape full of thick forests, rushing rivers, and a scarcity of food. A longer trip meant more risks and potential for complications as a result of food or water shortages along the way. As is shown in the film, Harriet is determined in the face of such challenges. It may have made her harrowing journeys all the more impressive had the film stuck to the original timeline and showed her running people all the way to Canada like she did in real life. For 15 years, John Winchester's wayward sons have been taking on mythical beings drawn from folklore and mythology. Of course, they're always a little bit tweaked to make for more exciting adventures, but those original legends are sometimes even weirder than what we see on TV. Here are the things that Supernatural gets wrong about a few interesting mythical beings. Ever since Bram Stoker published his 1897 novel Dracula and brought blood-sucking fiends to the world of pop culture, there have been countless vampire stories across all forms of media. As a result, it's nearly impossible to figure out what constitutes real vampire legends, and most stories have to spend at least a little time listing off what does and doesn't hold true from folklore. Supernatural is no exception. As early as Season 1, viewers see John Winchester giving his sons, and by extension the audience, a brief course in Vampire 101.
Most vampire lore is crap. A cross won't repel them, sunlight won't kill them, and neither will a stake to the heart.
On the show, vampires lack a few of their traditional weaknesses, but as with most things, cutting off their heads will solve your vampire problem pretty quickly. That leaves plenty of folkloric vampire traits on the table, though, like shape-shifting, the aversion to running water, or the idea that they're compelled to count things like a handful of seeds if it's thrown into their path, giving a would-be victim time for a hasty escape. Weirdly enough, Sesame Street didn't make that one up. While Supernatural's vampires can get by without stopping for a solid evening of counting grains of salt, the show actually did come up with its own completely bizarre set of weaknesses for its Draculas. There's Vamtonite, a toxic drug made from blood and corn syrup that burns the undead, and the Vampire Irradiation Gun, which harnesses the power of the atom to turn vampire blood into poison. That one's so effective that it's kind of weird that the Winchesters don't just blast everything with radiation to see if it works. But to be fair, you don't even want to run the tiniest chance that you're going to have to deal with a leprechaun who is also a Hulk. On the show, banshees are ghostly women whose ear-piercing scream can drive their victims to kill themselves, after which they snack on victims' frontal lobes. Even by supernatural standards, gobbling up the brains of people driven to end their own lives is pretty grim, and might just be the most brutal depiction of the creature in all of pop culture. It's also a pretty big departure from the banshee from Irish mythology. Supernatural shouldn't feel bad about getting this one wrong, since pretty much everyone else does, including the X-Men. In folklore, the banshee's loud scream is not harmful in itself. Instead, these mournful spirits are wailing in sadness as they predict someone's death, or herald the death of an absent loved one. It's not the cause, it's a reaction of sadness, which makes the banshee a much more tragic figure than the monster we see on the show. But hey, at least with this particular monster, Sam and Dean Winchester actually acknowledge they're departing from the legends and doing something different.
Banshees.
Banshees? I thought banshees were good.
The ones tied to the fairy lore are. They cry out as a warning to a victim's impending death.
Have you ever noticed that Supernatural mainly features evil creatures who just happen to look like regular human beings? It's almost as though whatever sinister force is populating the world with all these evil monsters has to work within a very specific budget. Anyway, there are plenty of monsters for whom that makes perfect sense. Vampires and werewolves are only recognizably non-human some of the time, for instance, and many of the more obscure creatures are at least mostly human in appearance. For some, however, showing them as a humanoid, two-legged person is a monumentally bizarre choice, which is what viewers ran up against in Season 13 when a bunch of Norse gods showed up and started hanging around. Loki? Sure, we're used to seeing that dude walking around. Odin and Thor? They've been depicted as a couple of hairy humanish fellas since at least the 13th century. But Sleipnir? Really? As you may already know, Sleipnir, despite being someone that Loki gave birth to after a particularly eyebrow-raising round of shape-shifting, is not exactly man-shaped in the traditional mythology. He's a horse with 8 legs. A horse with 8 legs whose hoofs struck the earth and created a canyon 300 feet deep. On the show, he's just a dude who eats a carrot at one point. While that's fine, we can't help but feel a little cheated that we didn't get a murder mystery where one of the suspects was just a gigantic spider horse with no explanation.
Yet another supernatural enemy who mysteriously takes on a budget-friendly human form in order to prey on its victims is the crocata, which shows up in Season 3.
A crocata.
That a sandwich?
Subcontinent scavenger, mimics loved ones, whispers come to me, then lures you into the dark and swallows your soul.
Crocata. Right, damn, that makes sense.
The big difference from real-life mythology here is that when it feeds on people, it can unhinge its jaw and reveal a mouthful of needle teeth, which is a pretty neat effect. Here's the thing though, the real-life crocata, lifted from East African and Indian folklore, is actually way easier to put in a live-action TV show than most of the other monsters that Supernatural has had to hammer into human form. 8-legged horses might require a bit of work, but this is the one time that making the monster a shape-shifting human was actually more difficult than the alternative. See, the original crocata is a dog. Like, that's it. It's just a dog. Or if you want to get technical about it, a hyena. Okay, so there's slightly more to it than that. It's a dog that can talk and, like in the show, mimics a human voice to lure its victims to their deaths. The myth is thought to have its origins in the hyena and the fact that they kind of sound like people laughing. Considering this is a show that did an entire episode crossing over with Scooby-Doo, who is both a famous talking canine who is also a cartoon, it's hard to believe Supernatural couldn't have given us a talking, man-eating dog if they'd wanted to. Of course, then they would have had to deal with having an episode where our heroes kill a talking dog with knives, so it's probably for the best that they went with sad Mr. Needlemouth instead. Sometimes, the only thing that carries over from myth and legend into Supernatural is a name. Such is the case for Dagon. On the show, it's a fairly standard issue demon, though a pretty powerful one. As one of the princes of hell, Dagon has all the powers you'd expect, plus the uncanny ability to melt a gun that can kill anything, which is the sort of thing that comes in awfully handy if you're going to spend your time fighting professional demon killers. Off the screen, Dagon is an ancient god who goes back about 4,300 years to ancient Mesopotamia, but is more commonly known from a cameo appearance in the Bible, which you can find in 1 Samuel chapter 5. If you're not up on the Old Testament, the short version is that the Philistines stole the Ark of the Covenant and brought it to a temple of Dagon, only to find out that when they showed up the next morning, the statue of Dagon had fallen over, as though bowing to the Ark.
That might not be where Supernatural lifted the name though, since, with all due respect to the first book of Samuel, there's a much more pop-culturally relevant place where it appears prominently.
One of H.P. Lovecraft's earliest stories was 1917's Dagon, in which the narrator encounters both a monolith and one of Lovecraft's typically horrifying deep ones, describing it as, quote, vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome. It darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. Be honest, you would pay a good amount of money to hear Jensen Ackles growl his way through calling something Polyphemus-like, wouldn't you? Aside from Sam and Dean Winchester, the most prominent member of the cast of Supernatural is Castiel, the angel who fished Sam out of hell back in Season 4 and became so beloved by fans that he wound up sticking around for the next decade. He's not the only angel to show up on the show by a long shot, and since they inhabit mortal forms while they're hanging out on Earth, it's rare that viewers actually get to see what they really look like. On those rare occasions that we do, however, we get beings composed of a brilliant light, complete with the wings you'd expect from classical depictions of God's messengers. Presumably, this is because the show's budget would have had a difficult time with gigantic monsters made of fire with thousands of eyes and faces in weird places, because that's the actual description of God's heavenly pals that shows up in the Bible. Or one of them, at least. Just like on the show, there are plenty of different kinds of angels described in books like Ezekiel, Daniel, and Isaiah, and most of them are way weirder than anything the CW could handle. Cherubim, for instance, are not the friendly naked babies that make people fall in love. They're creatures with 4 wings, brass hooves, and 4 faces: a lion, an ox, an eagle, and a human who may or may not resemble Misha Collins. And you thought the designers of Bayonetta were just weird. To bring it back to Cass, he's promoted to the Seraphim in Season 5, and while he cracks a few jokes about the massive hologram-like nature of his true form...
This is a vessel. My true form is approximately the size of your Chrysler building.
The capital C canonical description of the Seraphim is a little different. According to Isaiah, the Seraphim are relatively Misha Collins shaped, but with 6 wings, 2 for flying, 2 for covering their faces, 2 for covering their feet. While we're on the subject of angels, let's talk about Raphael. While he's not the biggest troublemaker the Winchesters have encountered, he's popped up in various plots, and even once attempted to restart the apocalypse after it had been prevented. And yes, the fact that someone can literally attempt to cause the apocalypse and not be considered one of the Winchesters' worst foes should give you an idea of just how terrible their lives can get.
It is a testament to my unending mercy that I don't smite you here and now.
The Raphael we see on Supernatural couldn't be further from his canonical counterpart, though. The show depicts him as severe, uncaring, and even cowardly, with little regard for humanity. In scripture, however, Raphael might be quick with a sarcastic comment, but is every bit as loyal as the other Ninja Turtles, and his skill with the ancient art of ninjutsu is... wrong Raphael. Raphael the angel, as he appears in the Bible, is anything but uncaring. In fact, he's the angel specifically associated with healing, showing up to rescue Lot from the destruction of Sodom in the book of Genesis, and is generally assumed to be the angel who stirs up a sort of first-century healing hot tub at Bethesda in the Gospel of John. Of course, he also shows up in the book of Tobit for what is basically an Old Testament buddy cop comedy. He disguises himself as a dude named Azariah, and at one point just bails to go beat up the demon Azazel, which is basically just an episode of Supernatural already. With all the stuff like angels and trips to heaven being used as plot points, it's pretty obvious that Supernatural lifts a fair amount of material from Jewish and Christian theology and legends. Even God himself shows up to hang out with the main characters with a frequency not seen since the book of Genesis. The show does, however, deviate from canon in some pretty notable ways, and one of them was the big villain of Season 11. There have been a lot of close readings of the Bible over the years, but even the most liberal examination omits one key thing that Supernatural based a whole year and change of storylines around. God is not, traditionally speaking, depicted as having an older sister. Supernatural, however, gives us a Mara, and like many older sisters, she has to deal with far more strict punishments than her little brother. Like, say, being sealed away in a formless void since the dawn of time after a war against her little bro and his squad of archangels. Admittedly, that's a bit harsher than what most older sisters experience, like being grounded for sneaking out, but it's the same basic idea, and definitely makes for an incredibly awkward visit at family gatherings, especially Christmas.
Okay, so nobody out there really believes that the History Channel's hit series Vikings is all that historically accurate. But you might be surprised just how many liberties the show takes with the truth. Here are some of the biggest inaccuracies and mistruths you'll find in Vikings. In Season 1, Vikings introduces Ragnar Lothbrok and his brother Rollo, and they're kind of a big deal as far as the show goes. Both were historical figures too, though Ragnar himself was more of a mythic King Arthur-style figure, while Rollo was more firmly grounded in actual historical record. But one thing is for sure, they definitely weren't brothers. Rollo was born in Scandinavia somewhere around 845 AD, and he lived until around 930. It's true that he was a Viking, and it's also true that he participated in raids in the Kingdom of West Francia and eventually became the first ruler of Normandy. but he was almost certainly not related to Ragnar Lothbrok, and it's unlikely the two ever even met. Ragnar, if indeed a real person, probably lived from around 820 to 865, which means he's at least 25 years Rollo's senior, so would have been approaching the end of his life just as Rollo was entering adulthood. So why does the show commit this particular historical error? Well, both men are fascinating figures, and it's easier for a television audience to invest in two divergent storylines if they're introduced at first as two parts of the same storyline. In one of its earliest episodes, the show demonstrates the total brutality of the Viking raiders by depicting an attack on a monastery at Lindisfarne, just off the coast of Northumbria. During the raid, Rollo kills an elderly Christian monk named Cuthbert, who was the mentor to many of the monks at the monastery. This actual raid happened at Lindisfarne in 793. And it really was as horrific as the series makes it out to be. Gold and silver was plundered, many monks perished, and some of the younger ones were abducted as slaves, which is basically what happens in Athelstan's storyline. But the major problem with the event as depicted is that the real Cuthbert didn't meet such a grisly end. In fact, he died of natural causes in 687, more than 100 years before the raid in Lindisfarne. The real-life Cuthbert, who was canonized after his death, was what's known as an incorrupt saint, which essentially means that his remains didn't decompose naturally after he died. His body and relics attracted pilgrims to the shrine of St. Cuthbert in Lindisfarne long before the Vikings ever showed up. And unlike the fictional version of Cuthbert, the real canonized version of Cuthbert actually survived the Viking raid. His body was moved, and after the Norman conquest, ended up in a shrine at Durham Cathedral, where it continued to attract pilgrims throughout the Middle Ages. One of the most egregious liberties the series takes is the idea that Ragnar Lothbrok discovered the British Isles. This little detail has peeved many a historian, including the University of Wisconsin's Eve Siebert, who writes for Skeptic.com, "England. Stop acting as if you're sailing for friggin' Atlantis. It's England. Everyone knows it's there. A good portion of Western Europe's invaded it already." The truth is that England was not some mystical land located far across the sea. There was trade going on between Scandinavians and Europeans long before the Viking Age. And one popular hypothesis among historians is that the Viking Age actually began, at least in part, because Scandinavian traders felt like they were being discriminated against by Christian Europeans. For that matter, the raid on Lindisfarne wasn't even the first Viking raid in Great Britain. Accounts exist of Norse attacks on Wessex and Kent for at least 5 years prior to 793. But hey, the treatment of the discovery of England does make Ragnar seem even more legendary, so it's at least effective as far as what showrunners were trying to accomplish. Anytime two cultures clash, there's bound to be a little awkwardness. Vikings handles that awkwardness well, too. During scenes in which Norsemen and Anglo-Saxons interact, the language barrier is depicted by having the characters speak to each other in subtitled Old Norse or Old English, which provides a kind of authenticity that is often lacking in other shows and movies. But one bigger language problem the show has sticks out at the very first glance. Nobody would have ever called someone else a Viking. For the most part, the show's Anglo-Saxon characters use terms like Northmen to describe Ragnar and his folk, but there are also scenes where the Vikings call each other Viking.
Because we are Vikings.
But the Norse word Vikingur was used to describe a specific person who went on an adventure or expedition overseas, and the word Viking was used to describe the activity itself. Neither word was used for an ethnic group, just as you wouldn't use road tripper as synonymous for American. It wasn't until the 14th and 15th centuries that the word Viking was applied to the Norse as a group. One thing you gotta give Vikings is that everybody looks pretty great, so thumbs up to the costume designers for making everyone look badass, and thumbs down to the costume designers too, for making those Vikings look nothing like the real deal. Sadly, the Vikings didn't wear fitted leather tunics studded with metal. Leather garments would have been worn loose, which was more practical, if far less cool. On top of that, the series tends to make its Vikings much more drab than they would have been. Rather than the faded browns and grays you'll find on the show, the real Vikings almost certainly wore colorful clothes, including red, yellow, blue, and purple, and they likely wore patterned clothing as well. Men wore long tunics and trousers made from linen or wool, and wool leg wrappings to help them stay warm during the harsh winters. Women, meanwhile, wore linen underdresses under a garment called a strap dress, and they would have likely worn them in various colors as well. So yeah, dark and broody might look cool, but the truth is those Norsemen looked pretty darn fly. In the series, the Vikings have some crazy elaborate hairstyles, including cool braids, partially shaved heads, and long beards. All very manly and punk rock for sure, which is clearly the look the show is going for, but is it accurate? Not really. For a start, Vikings probably didn't shave the sides of their heads. Anyone will tell you it can get pretty cold in Scandinavia, and deliberately exposing most of your head to those freezing temperatures seems like a bad idea. even for someone who's taken one too many axe blows to the head. Series creator Michael Hurst does think the Vikings might have shaved their heads to keep lice at bay, though obviously that would only really make sense if they were shaving their entire heads. The Bayeux Tapestry also suggests that 11th century Norman warriors shaved the back of their head, but it's debatable whether their Viking ancestors would have necessarily done the same 200 years earlier. Other contemporary sources suggest this hairstyle could have Danish origins, but it's definitely no sure thing. So did they wear those super elaborate braids? There doesn't seem to be much evidence for that either, but who says they didn't? As Hurst himself once said, "In the end, how the f do you know what the Vikings look like?" The Anglo-Saxon monk Athelstan is one of the series' most interesting characters. He serves the dual purpose of providing a window into the culture of ancient Britain, as well as providing viewers some of the show's most heart-wrenching moments.
We will never meet again, my friend. I have a feeling that your God might object to me visiting you in heaven.
But alas, such a friendship probably never happened, as there is no record of a monk-turned-Viking in the historical saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. Since the character is fictional, it's also pretty much a dead cert that he wasn't the secret father of Alfred the Great. The most objectionable treatment of Athelstan's character, though, is his crucifixion by Christians in the episode An Eye for an Eye. By some accounts, crucifixion probably ended in the 4th century, but if anyone was still doing it in Viking times, it sure as heck wasn't the Christians. In fact, historians say there aren't any examples of Christian crucifixion in the historical record, and that Christians of that time would have actually viewed crucifixion as something holy, reserved only for Jesus, and not some random lawbreakers. Unless you've got some serious issues to work through, you probably found the show's blood eagle scenes at least a little disturbing. This horrific Viking method of execution saw the victim have the skin on his back pulled away, his ribs hacked apart until they can be yanked up past his spine, and his lungs ripped out and placed on his back so that they will flutter bird-like as he dies. At some point, salt water is also poured into his wound. Basically, it's not a lot of fun. So did this horribly brutal form of execution actually exist? Well, until recently, historians mostly agreed that the blood eagle was real, if only because no later medieval writer could possibly dream up such a horrific thing. But most accounts either come directly out of the Norse and Icelandic sagas, which were almost certainly embellished, or from texts written hundreds of years after these events supposedly occurred. And the fact that descriptions of the blood eagle get more and more brutal and detailed as the centuries pass is further evidence that the ritual either didn't exist or has been greatly distorted through time. Although Vikings is undoubtedly a pretty show, it does take some liberties with the locations in which it's set. Take the temple to Odin at Uppsala, for example, which the show depicts as existing in a beautiful mountain setting. The actual temple of Uppsala was in Sweden, on a rather flat-looking grassy plain. The only hills of any kind are 3 burial mounds, which are thought to be the final resting places of 3 Norse kings. Then there's Ragnar's home. It's also worth mentioning that Kattegat, the show's central location, never existed, and Ragnar Lothbrok, if he did indeed exist, was probably from Denmark, or perhaps Sweden. The geography of the show looks distinctively Norwegian, however. All in all, the mountainous, snowy wonderland that Ragnar and his family inhabit may be beautiful, but it's not really accurate in any way. It serves a purpose, though. Showrunners want viewers to think of the Vikings as surviving in a wild, inhospitable landscape. In the end, the setting isn't supposed to be realistic. It's supposed to support the trajectory of the show. Longtime fans of the show might have noticed that despite taking place over many years, characters such as Ragnar and Lagertha tend to age pretty slowly, or pretty well at least. But time moves strangely in Vikings, as anyone who's tried to decipher the show's bizarre timeline will tell you. The raid on the monastery at Lindisfarne happens pretty early in the series, and that real-life event happened in 793. Then, in Season 3, events jump forward in time to the raid on Paris in 845, which was more than half a century after Lindisfarne. Okay, so maybe an elderly Ragnar could have pulled that off, especially when you take into account the weirdly slow rate at which he ages. But then, early in Season 4, the Vikings raid Paris again, a raid which happened between the years 885 and 886, nearly a whole century after the raid on Lindisfarne. And Ragnar definitely isn't 100 years old at that point. Things aren't made much easier by the fact that the Great Heathen Army, which is the center point of Season 4's final episodes, invaded England in 865, which is 20 years before the Paris raid depicted earlier that season. Confused? Who can blame you? Just chalk it up to creative license, sit back, and try to enjoy the violence.
Netflix's The Crown will last for 6 seasons, spanning the entire public life of Queen Elizabeth II. The Crown's crew takes pains to make it as accurate as possible, but there are some things that they just make up. Here's what The Crown gets wrong about history. The Crown deftly and cleverly explores both the professional and personal life of Queen Elizabeth II, and probably the most interesting moments come when those two parts intersect. Queen Elizabeth II took the throne in the early 1950s, the dark ages as far as gender equality and marriage is concerned. It was a commonly held notion that a man was the master of his home, outranking his wife. But what if that man's wife was the Queen of England, sovereign over tens of millions of people, including him, also a royal by birth? The Crown presented this conundrum, and it's a difficult one for Prince Philip to reconcile. After she puts him in charge of preparations for her 1953 coronation, Philip lets this shred of power go to his head, and he mentions how he doesn't think he should have to bow to the Queen, his wife, when she's officially crowned the ruler of his nation.
I will not kneel before my wife.
Your wife is not asking you to.
But my queen commands me.
Yes.
I beg you make an exception for me.
Writer Peter Morgan didn't take this episode from historical records, but rather created it to explore the gender politics of the 1950s. According to royal family expert Christopher Wilson, Philip had no problem with taking a knee. Wilson explained, "He came from a royal household which had borrowed so much of its ritual and protocol from the British royal family. He knew full well what was expected of him in public and was prepared to go along with it." While usually a highbrow historical drama, The Crown does get a bit soapy, such as in the first season episode Pride and Joy. Set in 1954, the episode sees Elizabeth and Philip touring the Commonwealth, which includes a stop in Australia. According to The Crown historical advisor and royal biographer Robert Lacey, one day the Queen and her husband were all set to walk onto the veranda of the house where they were staying to pose for some photos, but instead Philip came out alone. And then came the tennis racket, a pair of sneakers, and a very angry Elizabeth in pursuit, screaming at him. When they realized they had an audience, who were recording the whole thing, the royal couple retreated back inside. Elizabeth emerged a few minutes later and apologized, saying that the occasional fight happens in every marriage. As a sign of respect, the reporter who recorded the fight destroyed the footage, a moment depicted in The Crown. While the fight was real and witnessed by many, the reasons behind that fight were never divulged. That meant the Crown writer Peter Morgan had to come up with one. On screen, Philip gets Elizabeth mad by insulting both Australia and her deceased father.
40 a day your father smoked, and now I know why, poor bastard. He probably took one look at this tour and thought, do you know what, I'll be better off with cancer.
Shut up!
One of the most absurd moments in the first season of The Crown is depicted in the episode Act of God, when a thick, impenetrable smog darkens all of London in 1952. Countless residents are left unable to see where they're going, sending thousands to both the hospital and the undertaker. The usually very controlling UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill remains shockingly indifferent to the plight of his countrymen, calling the lethal smog an act of God, which prompts calls for his resignation. Churchill finally begins to take things seriously when his beloved assistant, a young woman named Venetia Scott, is struck dead by a bus driver who couldn't see her in the smog. A heartbroken Churchill then delivers a speech, promising England that he will do his best to prevent another smog-related tragedy. While the smog was real, the character of Venetia Scott was made up by the Crown writer Peter Morgan, but she represents a lot. Robert Lacey told the Daily Beast, "She's an amalgam of Churchill's secretaries. 5 or 6 of them wrote memoirs, so it's based on them. And she also serves as a symbol for the 6,000 or so people who died that month." In making a TV series about real events decades after they occur, scriptwriters can tell a full story with details that may emerge far after contemporary accounts. This is the method the Crown writer Peter Morgan took to weave together the plot of one first-season episode. In the wake of the Soviet Union testing nuclear weapons in 1953, and the subsequent scramble to meet with U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill suffers a stroke. His ally and head of Parliament's House of Lords, Lord Salisbury, works with the PM to keep this secret from both the Queen and the country, in an effort to keep Churchill's status and power secure. Elizabeth learns of the stroke when Churchill's private secretary, Jacques Colville, comes clean, prompting the Queen to rip the PM to shreds over his conspiring. The thing is, this dressing down never happened, because Churchill was long dead by the time the Queen found out about the stroke. She heard about Churchill's ailment when the world did, in 1985, when Colville revealed the truth in his memoirs. Late in the first season of The Crown, and in his long career as a statesman, Winston Churchill sits for a grand portrait commissioned by Parliament as a one-of-a-kind 80th birthday gift for the man who deftly guided the country through World War II. The portrait is publicly unveiled in 1954, and The Crown suggests that this is the first time Churchill sees it, judging by his almost visceral reaction of disgust and disappointment.
A broken, sagging, pitiful creature, squeezing and squeezing!
He later accepts the not flattering painting as truthful, and that he is an old, tired man who should resign his powerful post. And while that painting was supposed to wind up hanging in Parliament, it doesn't make it. Churchill's wife, Clementine, has it unceremoniously burned in their backyard. That's not the full story of the ill-fated Churchill portrait, though. For one, the Churchills likely saw the painting prior to its public debut, and in reality, they delegated the act of burning the portrait to someone else. Clementine Churchill told her secretary, Grace Hamblin, to dispose of it. Hamblin and her brother removed it from the Churchills' basement in the middle of the night, put it in a van, drove to the brother's house, and burned it there. The story of choosing between love and royal duty is an important part of The Crown. In the first season, Princess Margaret falls in love with divorced Royal Air Force pilot Peter Townsend. But alas, their love just could not be. Protocols surrounding the royal family prevented Margaret from marrying the guy. Had she done so, she would have had to abandon her title, so she chooses royal duties over love. Also in the series, Elizabeth makes it very difficult for their romance to bloom. The Queen decides to let the law stand, ruining her sister's romance. She could have made an exception and granted permission, but she didn't.
You gave me your word. Promise me you'd still be there when I got back.
I did.
Why is he been sent away? Banished like some criminal.
What The Crown doesn't show is that the Queen actually tried to get the law changed so Margaret might have a happy ending. The legal battle wasn't worth it to Margaret, and she and Townsend split up. The Crown isn't kind to Prince Philip. In the show, he's cranky, catty, selfish, and just wants to fly his airplane. A Season 2 episode provides the reason for Philip's nastiness. A stressful, even tragic childhood. A military coup kicked his uncle off the Greek throne, forcing the whole family to flee. A few years later, his mother fought severe mental health issues and was hospitalized against her wishes, and his father ran away with a mistress. Even sadder, the fate of his sister, Cecily. During a flight to a wedding, she gave birth, and the plane crashed, killing mother and newborn infant. According to The Crown, it should have been Philip on that plane. He was supposed to go, but got held behind at his boarding school because he got in a fight. Worse, Philip's father blames him for her death.
You're the reason we're all here. Burying my favorite child.
That will mess up a person for sure, although that's not quite how it all happened. Royal biographer Hugo Vickers called this depiction, quote, a monstrous lie. The truth is, there was no fight Philip was involved in at school, and Cecily was going to the wedding with or without her brother. Early in the second season of The Crown, Prince Philip attends the Thursday Club, a group of gentlemen who meet for lunch once a week, most often at a central London seafood restaurant called Wheeler's. On The Crown, these meetings are depicted as raucous affairs. However, historian Max Hastings, the son of a member, says the goings-on were blown out of proportion. Rumors of debauchery were just that, rumors, with tales of parties never verified. That's the problem with secret societies. They're secretive. That means stuff depicted on The Crown, like Philip's cohort Michael Parker enjoying a dalliance with a waitress and sending letters to the club detailing his conquests, were invented for the show.
To our wives and sweethearts.
May they never meet.
For that matter, the series fudges a lot of details regarding the fall of Michael Parker. It's likely that Parker and Philip's activities on their 1956 tour on the royal yacht Britannia were much less improper than the show suggests. For example, there was likely no salacious letter that led to Parker's divorce, although his wife did move to divorce him in early 1957. And a day after news of it leaked, he resigned from on board the Britannia, with Philip in attendance. While he may have felt pressure from Philip, he resigned of his own accord. As for the reasons behind the divorce, a judge granted it in March 1958 on the grounds of adultery, specifically that Michael Parker had slept with a housekeeper in a Chelsea apartment. In October 1966, an avalanche of coal waste descended upon a junior high school in Aberfan, Wales, killing 116 children and 28 adults. The disaster is unspeakably awful and sad, and according to The Crown, Queen Elizabeth II was none too affected by it.
The Crown visits hospitals, Martin, not the scenes of accidents.
Her hand forced, the Queen finally does travel to Aberfan, but only after Prince Philip and Lord Snowdon put in initial appearances on her behalf. According to survivors of the Aberfan tragedy, the Crown presented inaccurate portrayals of both Her Majesty and the details of the post-disaster mass funeral. Even though Jeff Edwards of Aberfan consulted Netflix on the episode, he says they mischaracterized the Queen, whom he says is quite different than the Crown's, quote, callous presentation. As for other errors, Edwards also noted that the coffins in the episode's mass funeral were wooden, while they were actually white, and that Prince Philip didn't actually attend the service. After returning from their trip to the moon in July 1969, Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin became the most famous and lauded people in the world, surpassing the attention paid to even the royal family. They actually visited Buckingham Palace as part of their Victory Lap, an episode dramatized during the third season of The Crown. These moon men enjoy a sit-down with Prince Philip, a huge fan of space exploration and the Apollo landing, up until he meets those astronauts. During their conversation, he realizes that they're regular people who changed the world for better, whereas he's a man born into power and privilege who hasn't done all that much with those advantages. This humbling moment, ironically enough, turns Philip into a regular guy for a spell. He experiences a bit of a midlife crisis. It makes for good TV, but this plot development is mostly speculative. There's no real proof that Philip was a huge NASA fan, and while the Apollo 3 did visit Buckingham Palace, there's no record of a private chit-chat with a duke. So if Philip ever did start to question his place in the universe, it wasn't Buzz Aldrin's fault.
It may look pretty true to life, but there's plenty of factual inaccuracies in Netflix's Monster. Here's what the show gets wrong about the Jeffrey Dahmer story. The dramatized version of Jeffrey Dahmer's life shows him getting a job in a blood plasma clinic in Milwaukee. While there, he gets a hold of a bag of blood and sidles up to the roof, where he proceeds to consume it. This isn't strictly accurate. It's true that after being discharged from the military, where he worked as a Germany-based army medic between 1979 and 1981, he got a job as a phlebotomist in a plasma clinic. His discharge from the army happened due to accusations of alcohol abuse. After leaving, he got a job in a delicatessen, but was thrown out of the hotel he was lodging in for not paying the rent. He had stints living with his father and stepmother, as well as his aunt, punctuated by trouble with the law.
I knew I was sick or evil, or both. Now I believe I was sick.
Only a week after he moved in with his family, he was arrested for disorderly conduct related to his drinking. Dahmer was fined $60 and given a 10-day jail sentence, which was suspended. It wouldn't be the first time he was arrested on this basis. When he moved in with his aunt, Dahmer started working in the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. Yet, surprisingly for a future cannibal, Dahmer did not initially like the taste of blood. Rather than drinking a whole bag of it, he reportedly took some from the blood plasma clinic where he worked, trying a vial before spitting it out. Jeffrey Dahmer's violent rampage came to an end in 1991 when he was caught after one of his victims alerted the police, having narrowly escaped from Dahmer's apartment. The killer was tried, convicted, and given 15 consecutive life sentences. His attempt to plead insanity was rejected, and in total, he was sentenced to 941 years in prison. Yet, he would serve less than 3 of those years before meeting his ultimate fate.
I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself.
Fellow prisoner Christopher Scarver, another convicted murderer, had grown angry with Dahmer's behavior in prison. Scarver claimed to the New York Post that he was particularly upset over Dahmer's fondness for pretending ketchup was blood and shaping prison food into what looked like human body parts. Dahmer's murder apparently came about because Scarver felt that he was unrepentant about his crimes, something his fellow prisoner claimed he could tell from the serial killer's eyes. However, Scarver later wrote in a blog post that the Post misquoted him. Dahmer's lawyer also contested Scarver's claims, saying that taunting people wasn't his former client's style. Monster shows Scarver attacking inmate Jesse Anderson before moving on to Dahmer. However, in reality, he went for Dahmer first. Although he had initially been isolated from the other prisoners, Dahmer had requested a greater level of interaction, including being able to work and eat meals with the general prison population. He apparently used to taunt them by saying, "I bite." When left alone with Anderson and Dahmer while on cleaning duty, Scarver attacked and beat Dahmer to death before turning on Anderson. Jeffrey Dahmer stated that one of his victims, a man from the deaf community named Tony Hughes, only became known to him the night before he was murdered. This was untrue. Although Monster shows them dating over the course of 1991, in reality, they had known each other since 1989. According to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, a friend of Hughes stated that the pair had been seeing each other for 2 years before Hughes was abducted. Dahmer had visited her house at least 6 times in search of him. According to Esquire, Hughes had become a member of the deaf community when some medication he received as an infant led to a permanent loss of hearing. He also became a mute. Despite these setbacks, his mother reported that he was a happy and confident young man who had modeling aspirations while he was a college student in Madison, Wisconsin. Monster shows Hughes and Dahmer forming a relationship where Dahmer displays an unusual degree of tenderness towards the other man. Hughes was seen alive for the final time in May 1991 at Milwaukee's 219 Club. Dahmer lured him back to his apartment, drugged him, and murdered him, dismembering his body in the process and keeping his skull as a trophy. Monster shows Glenda Cleveland, the conscience of the whole saga, living in the same building as Jeffrey Dahmer. Although Cleveland lived near Dahmer and tried to alert the police, she was not his direct neighbor like the show claims. In the show, Cleveland's suspicions are piqued when she hears the disturbing sounds of screams and a body being dismembered coming through the air vent into her apartment. She takes note of this and is furious with the police as they only apprehend Dahmer when his potential 18th victim, Tracy Edwards, escapes from Dahmer's apartment and alerts them about his attempted murder. She had tried numerous times to contact the police and the FBI about her suspicions after she recognized one of the missing men as someone Dahmer had interacted with, but it was weeks until Dahmer was caught. Yet the show deviates from the truth in that Cleveland didn't live in the Oxford Apartments building. Instead, she was in a building nearby. The Milwaukee Sentinel-Journal points out that there was a moment in the Netflix show when Dahmer makes her a sandwich, something that happened to other people in his building, but was cited in particular by Pamela Bisson, one of Dahmer's neighbors. A chilling exchange of this nature happens during the show, but with Cleveland, who never experienced it. Monster, therefore, seems to fuse the characters of Bisson and Cleveland together. The officers in the Jeffrey Dahmer case faced heavy criticism rather than veneration as the show implies, even though both men saw their careers recover. In Monster, Balzerzak and Gabrish are shown receiving Officer of the Year awards for finally apprehending Dahmer. In reality, no such things happened. An AP story from 1991 shows that the men tried to defend their actions in the face of staunch criticism and a suspension from duty after it was revealed they had unknowingly returned one of Dahmer's victims to him. 14-year-old Konorak Synthosamphone had escaped naked and bleeding from Dahmer's apartment, but was returned and left there after the 2 patrolmen believed Dahmer's story that they were lovers and that Synthosamphone was an older man who was simply drunk. Dahmer later admitted to murdering the teenager just after the police dropped him off. The officers involved said that there seemed to be no other red flags. Both were suspended for 7 weeks and then fired. However, Balzerzak and Gabrish were both reinstated in 1994 and given around $55,000 of back pay. The judge who made the decision claimed the penalty for their conduct had been too harsh, a decision that was heavily criticized by community activists, as it was believed the men's homophobia and racism stopped any further investigation. Somsak Synthosamphone was attacked by Jeffrey Dahmer in 1988 after the older man persuaded him to come back to his apartment and pose nude for him. Somsak agreed to do it after Dahmer offered him money. Since escaping from communist-dominated Laos, the Synthosamphone family had been taking jobs as welders and machinists to support the family. Dahmer had recently moved from his grandmother's house and into an apartment of his own, giving him more space to pursue his crimes. Although he didn't try to kill the teenager, Dahmer drugged and assaulted him, causing him to flee in terror. Dahmer was arrested in September 1988, and in January 1989, he pled guilty to the charges of second-degree sexual assault and tempting a child for immoral reasons. Judge William Gardner is castigated in the show for not understanding the broken English of the father of the Synthosamphone brothers. However, Anne E. Schwartz's book Monster, The True Story of the Jeffrey Dahmer Murders, states that the family was not present for the sentencing as they were not told it was happening. Dahmer was ordered to serve a year at a work release camp, followed by a 5-year probationary period. He wrote a letter expressing remorse and was released in 1990, a decision that the New York Times highlights the family were not told about, although the Milwaukee Police Department insisted they were. Ron Flowers came perilously close to taking Jeffrey Dahmer's final body count to 18 rather than 17. Dahmer offered him assistance when he saw that Flowers was struggling with a broken-down car. Monster shows him taking Flowers back to his grandmother's house and drugging his coffee with the intention of ultimately murdering him.
There was a big element of wanting complete control over someone.
However, the Netflix series shows Dahmer's grandmother intervening to prevent it. She gets suspicious about Flowers' unconscious state, despite Dahmer's claims that he simply had too much to drink, insisting on staying awake until Flowers comes around. She even goes as far as escorting the two men to the bus stop so that Dahmer makes sure Flowers gets home. The young man wakes up at the end of the bus route, being told to leave by the driver, and fully gains consciousness in hospital. Yet the tab reports this not to be true. What actually happened was that Flowers, despite being a fairly lean figure in the show, weighed 250 pounds and was deemed to be too heavy a potential corpse for Dahmer, who was unconvinced that he would be able to drag the body away to hide it. Flowers only remembered going to Dahmer's house before waking up in hospital. He claimed the other man had assaulted him, but when the police questioned Dahmer, they believed his version of events. The first episode of Monster shows Dahmer's last potential victim, Tracy Edwards, trying frantically to leave Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment after Dahmer threatens him with a knife.
He told me at that point if I wouldn't do what he said, he would kill me.
He somehow manages, despite the door to Dahmer's apartment being heavily secured with multiple locks. Edwards had been lured to Dahmer's residence by the promise of money in exchange for his posing for nude photographs. He became suspicious when he noticed foul odors and boxes of hydrochloric acid. Dahmer then handcuffed him before getting him to be the subject of his Polaroids. Edwards calmed him down when Dahmer became violent, but punched him in the face during the killer's lapse in concentration. He would later claim that Dahmer underestimated him. Upon escaping, he was able to convince the police that Dahmer had tried to kill him. The investigation of Dahmer's apartment led to his final arrest and ultimate conviction. However, the show got one detail of the scenes with Edwards wrong. There were only 2 locks on Dahmer's door. The Lad Bible describes how Edwards' account of the story changed after the incident, claiming during appearances on talk shows that there were multiple locks on the door. Additionally, the blog for the Little Dean Jail Crime Museum draws attention to a photo of the door that was taken at the crime scene, which formed a part of the police file. It only shows 2 locks. A year before his son died in prison, Jeffrey Dahmer's father Lionel wrote a book titled A Father's Story, in which he analyzes the various reasons for why his son might have turned out the way he did.
His mother didn't know, I didn't know, and apparently none of his playmates knew.
He includes his belief that his wife's addiction to various medications, including sleeping pills while pregnant with Jeffrey, hindered their son's emotional development. Monster highlights that she was diagnosed with postpartum psychosis. Yet Lionel also blames himself, with the book detailing how he had a youthful fascination with using hypnosis as a tool of control. He also had similar fantasies to his son about wondering what it would be like to murder people. In the book, he laments having not made the connection between this and his son's more psychopathic tendencies. The Netflix series shows that the book was a commercial failure, even if it gained some favorable reviews from critics. Yet the show is incorrect when it states that all 17 families of Dahmer's victims tried to sue for royalties due to Lionel not gaining permission to use their life stories. In reality, the Orlando Sentinel highlights that only 2 families tried to do this. According to Collider, the book was so commercially unsuccessful that it didn't generate enough profit to give any meaningful support to the families of Dahmer's victims. Joyce Dahmer, Jeffrey's mother, reportedly tried to publish an account refuting her ex-husband's claim that her health issues contributed to her son's twisted development. Such a book was never released.
Everyone loves a good zombie movie, or a good viral contagion movie, or really any movie with an apocalypse and a hero and a sepia filter. But it turns out that Hollywood doesn't always spend much time on proper science. Here are things movies get wrong about virus outbreaks. People slowly dying of a viral infection isn't very cinematic. Hollywood needs its thrillers to be kind of thrilling, so it isn't surprising they tend to jazz up how viruses typically work. In the 1995 film Outbreak, the fictional Mataba virus isn't just 100% fatal, it also has an incubation period measured in hours and kills its victims within a day. While it's true that some viruses can kill you in about a day, there's a delicate balance between speed and viability for a virus. In short, viruses that kill you super fast not only destroy their own host, they can't spread effectively either, so outbreaks tend to be pretty limited. Even the fastest viruses tend to have incubation periods ranging from several days to several years, and the illness part can last days, weeks, or months. And fatality rates for most pandemics aren't nearly as lethal as Hollywood likes them to be. The H1N1 flu, also called swine flu, was less than 0.1% fatal, while real-life Ebola is 40% fatal. That's pretty terrifying, but not terrifying enough for a Hollywood thriller. The movie 28 Days Later is a prime example of how Hollywood likes its viral outbreaks, fast and furious, with the world going from hunky-dory to burned-out shell in just under a month. This obsession with speed also goes for the process of infection. In 28 Days Later, victims go from exposure to full-on infected almost immediately, and even less fantastic films often depict people going from exposure to dead in a few days or hours. But the fact is, it takes about a full minute for your blood to circulate throughout the body, so even if we stipulate a virus could get in and immediately start hijacking your cells for its own purposes, it probably takes a minimum of a couple minutes to do so. And in reality, pandemics take a long time too, and so far not one has managed to actually destroy the world. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention notes that the 1918 flu pandemic took a year to play itself out, and the AIDS epidemic slow burned for years. Even something like the Black Death took 4 years to eventually burn itself out. While it was devastating, it didn't end civilization. One inconvenient fact about virus outbreaks is the length of time it takes to develop a vaccine, so most films depict this happening unbelievably quickly. Many movies will have a vaccine developed in a few days or even hours. Even the film Contagion, which is largely praised for its scientific accuracy in depicting a fictional pandemic, shows scientists isolating the pathogen in less than 2 weeks and creating a viable vaccine for it in a few months. It's thrilling and it seems like a reasonable time frame, but it isn't. In reality, the College of Physicians of Philadelphia reports that it can take up to 15 years to develop a vaccine, and even under emergency conditions, it can take a whole year. Creating a vaccine requires studying the pathogen, identifying the antigens that will help combat it in the body, then testing to ensure that what you come up with isn't worse than the pathogen you're trying to destroy. After that, you need to manufacture the vaccine in significant quantities and actually get it to the population. Hollywood prefers to hit the easy button on this process. This makes sense for dramatic purposes because you don't want the last hour of a movie to just be one long shot of people working in a lab. Movies often act like slapping a surgical mask on your face makes you invulnerable to viral threats. However, viruses tend to be tiny, and Dr. William Schaffner, an infectious disease specialist at Vanderbilt University, says the masks that can actually protect you make it incredibly hard to breathe. Regular surgical masks won't do for an airborne virus, but are often treated as nearly magical in their ability to ward off disease. Some movies do better depicting large-scale personal protective equipment, like full bodysuits with helmets that use positive air pressure to protect people. But even when they show scientists and doctors using such equipment, you'll likely see a million other mistakes, like walking from an infected room to another area without decontaminating or removing the helmet.
Keep your helmet! Casey! Keep his helmet on! Keep his helmet on! Don't let him expose himself, Casey!
In the movie Outbreak, Colonel Sam Daniels is confused when the Ebola-like Mataba virus seems to be infecting people who haven't had any contact with other infected people. It should be impossible because the virus is transmitted via physical contact and exchange of bodily fluids. Then he has one of those Hollywood genius moments. He notices all the ventilation ducts in the room and realizes the truth.
Mataba is only spread through direct human contact. Now, you said that yourself, Sam.
I know what I told you, but now I'm telling you we're facing a new strain.
In other words, the virus has mutated. Viruses mutate all the time. That's how new forms of diseases keep cropping up and how viruses that usually affect animals can cross over to the human population. But what they don't do is start off being transmitted in one way and then suddenly go airborne via sneezing. In the film I Am Legend, the virus basically turns people into vampire zombies and leaves Dr. Robert Neville as the only man alive. Neville is somehow immune to the virus, and he uses his own blood to develop a cure. The only problem is that it doesn't make any sense. A genetic immunity like that can't be transmitted to others, and if Neville's immunity allowed him to produce antibodies that would make this possible, first he'd have to be infected so his body could produce those antibodies. If you watched Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, you might have noticed a familiar phrase when the virus is being explained: Patient Zero.
A lab technician now known as Patient Zero.
This phrase entered the general consciousness during the early years of the AIDS crisis, usually referring to one flight attendant who was incorrectly portrayed as wildly promiscuous and more or less responsible for the spread of the disease in the United States. However, the concept of a patient zero is completely misunderstood. In fact, the whole theory is wrong, as there were likely plenty of other HIV-infected people at the time, especially considering the lengthy incubation period of the disease. And as investigative journalist Dina Fine-Marin points out, disease vectors are just too complex for a single person to be blamed. HIV probably arrived in the US much earlier, possibly as early as 1971. In other words, while Patient Zero sounds appropriately ominous for a movie, it's trash science. In World War Z, Brad Pitt figures out that the infected will completely ignore people who have a fatal disease. There is some logic to this, as a virus's main goal in life is to replicate. A dying host would be a poor choice, and in nature, feigning death or infirmity to confuse predators is fairly common. However, viruses obviously aren't predators or capable of that kind of complex thought. But as biophysicist Scott Forth at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute points out, the other problem here is that the virus would need to imbue its host humans with superpowers. The virus needs the host human to smell disease on the dying person, and we humans just don't smell all that well. In Hollywood movies, there's no such thing as a boring death scene. When any character dies in a Hollywood epidemic, it's usually pretty exciting and kind of gruesome. The goal is drama, after all. When Gwyneth Paltrow's character kicks it in the film Contagion, for example, her horrified husband watches her twitch and writhe as medical professionals look on more or less helplessly. But most deaths from viruses like the flu stem from secondary factors, like bacteria getting into the lungs to cause pneumonia, or getting bacteria into the blood to cause sepsis, or because the virus exacerbates existing weaknesses like diabetes or asthma. That's why most deaths from any viral outbreak happen among the elderly and the already ill, not the young and healthy. In other words, most people pass quietly after lingering unconscious for a while, which isn't very cinematic, it's just tragic. Audiences like to see extraordinary people accomplishing extraordinary tasks, like a brilliant virologist who single-handedly figures out how to cure a deadly plague. A whole bunch of films about various terrifying viral outbreaks feature a single heroic scientist who more or less saves the day, whether it's Dr. Neville in I Am Legend or Colonel Sam Daniels, MD, in Outbreak. Even the relatively grounded and realistic Contagion features a single scientist developing a vaccine, which she tests on herself. Reality is messier and less dramatic, of course. Abigail Zugger, MD, Associate Clinical Professor of Medicine at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, describes modern medicine and especially public health efforts as a team sport. The idea of a single genius saving the day is fun, but almost totally inaccurate. The reality would be large teams of scientists working on these outbreaks, following some pretty rigid protocols when it came to testing, and no one person would be responsible for the solution. The movies always like to imagine that our government agencies and bureaucracies are incredibly well-funded, with access to cutting-edge technology and instantaneous data. Even when the whole world is collapsing in a movie like World War Z, Brad Pitt knows exactly where to go as he chases down clues. In movies like Contagion, the scientists are able to pop up sophisticated models of the virus's genome and show nifty videos where every single case of infection pops up on a world map, and computers offer instant, terrifying projections of just how fast the world will be consumed in a viral apocalypse.
Power down the main screen and the workstations.
Powering down main screen and workstations.
Dr. David A. Ross, the president and CEO of the Task Force for Global Health, says the reality is a messy process where some info comes in on paper, the rest digitally. Most importantly, all of it comes in non-standard forms requiring sorting and manipulation. That means the likelihood of instant, easily understood computer graphics and reliable models showing precise spread patterns is very, very low. And that's assuming the data isn't coming from a secretive, paranoid, totalitarian country with an interest in fudging all the numbers. Maybe we don't need to point this out explicitly, but zombies resulting from some sort of virus are kind of unlikely. Movies sure do love the idea of a rage virus or a zombie virus that reanimates us or turns us into mindless killing machines, and audiences love that idea too. Films like 28 Days Later and World War Z play with the idea that zombies, which are clearly fiction, could become reality if the right pathogen mutated in the right way. But nope, it's pretty much all fiction. It's true that rabies, the most frightening of all viral threats, is theoretically capable of producing a rage virus-like pandemic, according to some virologists. But it would need to be a lot more contagious than it currently is to pose a global threat. Rabies can only spread through physical contact, usually a bite from an infected creature, and it has a very long incubation period of up to a year. A true zombie-like experience would require a lot more work to make happen. In his book, The Zombie Autopsies, Dr. Stephen C. Schlossman imagined a scenario where scientists fuse a protein known as a prion to an airborne virus, resulting in a zombie disease. However, the big takeaway from Schlossman's book isn't that such a plague is possible, but that it would be incredibly unlikely to ever happen. Thor was around long before Marvel added him to their roster of superheroes. They've done a good job of translating Norse mythology to the page and screen, but there have been a few big changes. From Sif's hair to Hela's parents, here are the things Marvel changed about Thor's mythology. The most obvious difference between Marvel's Thor and the original figure, at least from a visual standpoint, is his hair color. The Odinson who hangs out with the Avengers is famously blonde, to the point of being nicknamed Goldilocks by a few of his teammates when they're feeling brave enough to throw shade at a guy who obliterates fire giants with his magic hammer. The original version, however, is usually depicted with a slightly different hairstyle.
By Odin's beard you shall not cut my hair, lest you feel the wrath of the mighty Thor.
In the book Vikings, A History of the Northmen, W.B. Bartlett cites legends that refer to Thor as being red-haired, red-bearded, red-eyed, as shown in much of the artwork that was around long before Jack Kirby designed Marvel's Thor for the comics page. In fact, Kirby did stories about 2 other versions of Thor before he co-created the Marvel character, with a red-haired look much more in line with the legends. It's worth noting that this has been addressed in the comics, although the explanation might not be as satisfying as you want. Thor just says the legends got it wrong. As for the real-world reason why, that's never been explained, but we have a pretty good guess. The early Thor stories were essentially Marvel's take on Superman, which is reflected in his blue and yellow costume with the long red cape. If he had red hair, it would have blended in with the cape, confusing the look and making it a lot less striking than the contrast of the yellow hair. Marvel's depiction of Sif also has the distinction of having a different hair color than her mythological counterpart. In the comics and films, Sif has always had black hair, but in mythology, her hair is golden, as in literally made of gold. One of the most famous Norse myths is the story of how Loki cut off Sif's hair, because, he's the god of mischief. To make up for it, he replaced Sif's hair with a new set of beautifully cascading locks that were magically crafted by dwarves. There's never been an official reason for Marvel's choice, but it's easy to assume that the change was made to make Sif more of a visual contrast with Thor on the comics page. There was, however, a suitably mythological incontinuity reason, in that Marvel's dwarves crafted her hair from the darkness of night rather than gold. The differences don't stop there, though. Sif in the comics is a fierce warrior, a shield maiden of Asgard, as deadly in combat as Thor himself. With all due respect to the original Sif, that's not quite her classic portrayal. The original myths depict her as more of an earth goddess, and in fact, many scholars suggest that Sif and Thor's marriage is symbolic of rain falling on crops. That marriage is something else that's absent from the comics. Marvel's Thor and Sif have a more on-again, off-again relationship on the page, depending on how the current creative team feels about Jane Foster.
Sorry to hear that Jane dumped you.
She didn't dump me, I dumped her. It's a mutual dumping.
Jane herself is also a pretty big departure from the myths of old. Unlike Greek mythology, there aren't a lot of dalliances between gods and humans in the Norse stories. In the comics and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, some of the most long-standing and crucial elements of the stories are the mystical enchantments on Thor's hammer Mjolnir.
Whosoever holds of this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor.
The hammer can only be lifted by the worthy, whether it's the Odinson or not. It's a big deal, to the point that Marvel's Thor isn't just the god of thunder. He declared himself the god of the unworthy, a symbol for everyone who strives to be better than they are. It's such an intrinsic part of Thor's story that if you're not familiar with the mythology, it might surprise you to find out that it's entirely a creation of the comics, and was added to the story so that Thor could have a secret identity. The myths have no such enchantment, and the idea that it would be added in order to teach him humility doesn't really ring true either. For all of his quickness to anger, Thor's giant smiting generally had Odin's stamp of approval. It is true that, mythologically speaking, Thor was the only one who could lift Mjolnir, but that wasn't because of an enchantment. It was because Mjolnir was just, really heavy. So heavy, in fact, that Thor had 2 other special pieces of equipment. The Arngray Pier and the Megan Gjord, iron gloves and a belt of strength respectively, allowed him to use the hammer. Those occasionally do exist in the comics, but they're more of an in case of Ragnarok contingency than everyday wear. The Megan Gjord even has another enchantment, in that it doubles Thor's strength but leaves him severely weakened afterward, to explain why he doesn't wear it all the time. Marvel Comics added an A at the end of their Goddess of Death's name, presumably to make it easier to distinguish Hel the goddess from Hel the realm in which she lives. Of course, it also may have been an attempt to get around the censorship of the comics code, which might have had a problem with that particular name. If that was the case, they made the right choice. It would be a lot less intimidating for Thor to be fighting an immortal foe named Hek.
It's come to my attention that you don't know who I am.
There are bigger differences, though. For one thing, she's not Odin's daughter. According to the Eddas, her father is Loki. She's also depicted with a far more horrifying appearance than the one we saw in the MCU. As the goddess of the dead, she's described in the Prose Edda as being half black-blue and half flesh-colored, which is sometimes interpreted as half of her body being alive and half being either a rotting corpse or a skeleton. On top of that, for some reason, the original myths never once mention her big pointy hat. Either way, it's a pretty far cry from goth Cate Blanchett in Thor Ragnarok. In the comics, Thor was taught humility by being incarnated on Earth as Dr. Don Blake, but that wasn't the first time that the God of Thunder found himself reborn as a human. In what seems like an effort to tie their character into every piece of Norse-related mythology, Marvel once published a story with another mortal identity. Hundreds of years before Thor joined the Avengers, he walked the Earth as Siegfried, the dragon-slaying hero best known from Richard Wagner's operatic Ring Cycle. Siegfried was also called Sigurd, a name Thor later used in a short-lived secret identity that was literally just wearing glasses. Siegfried is also a completely different mythological figure. In fact, he doesn't even have a hammer. His weapons of choice are a giant sword called Balmung and an invisibility cloak, making him more of the Norse mythological equivalent of Harry Potter than someone you'd mistake for Thor. That same story revealed that the heroine Valkyrie wasn't just named Brunhilde, she was the Brunhilde from Siegfried's legend, having also been sent to Earth for some reason. The weirdest part? Thor was also incarnated as Sigmund, Siegfried's father. That means that for a short time, Thor was actually his own dad. Odin has some very strange ideas about how to teach his kids a lesson.
American Horror Story isn't shy about including lots of real-life horrors, but it doesn't always get that history completely accurate, especially when it comes to actual historical figures that pop up in the show's various storylines. Here are things American Horror Story gets wrong about history. 2019's American Horror Story 1984 was a retro throwback to slasher films of the 1980s. Inspired by Friday the 13th, Sleepaway Camp, Halloween, and more, the story focused on the fictional Camp Redwood, the site of numerous killings and ghastly goings-on. But to add a little zest to the story, creators added real-life serial killer Richard the Night Stalker Ramirez into the mix, where he attacked the camp's counselors and openly worshipped Satan. Ramirez really did break into homes and kill the occupants, and he really did have a strange obsession with Satan. Even Ramirez's origin story, portrayed in a flashback, is pretty accurate. Ramirez's capture, where he was chased by an angry mob through the streets of Los Angeles after being identified at a convenience store, really happened too. As amazing as that sounds. Other than the obviously fictional parts about Ramirez killing teens at a summer camp, the show gets his life story surprisingly close to the real thing. There is one thing that definitely didn't happen with Ramirez, though. He never escaped from prison, as he does in the season's final episodes. Using the power of Satan, Ramirez is able to trick a guard into releasing him, and he begins a journey of revenge from there. The real Richard Ramirez spent the rest of his life in jail, though. He stayed on death row until 2013, when he died of lymphoma. American Horror Story Coven, the show's third season, was a fan favorite. The storyline involves a group of young witches studying at Miss Robichaux's Academy in New Orleans, where they learn the magic secretly passed down through generations by survivors of the Salem witch trials. Alongside this are numerous plot threads featuring real-life New Orleans history and actual denizens of the city's past. One of these is Madame Delphine Lalaurie, played by Kathy Bates. A socialite and slave owner, Madame Lalaurie had a dark secret. In her spare time, she tortured and mutilated her slaves for various medical experiments in her mansion's attic slave quarters.
Bonsoir, my pets. Did you all miss me?
That actually happened. Lalaurie was a monster and was found out by her neighbors when one of her cooks intentionally set fire to the house to expose her crimes, according to Deep South magazine. In the show, Lalaurie was tricked into taking an immortality potion and buried in a box until the modern day. But the real Lalaurie had a far less dramatic fate. She fled New Orleans before she could be brought to justice. Although where she ended up afterward isn't entirely clear, it's believed that she made her way to Paris and eventually died there. American Horror Story's 8th season, Apocalypse, aired in 2018 and finally revisited lingering plots from Murder House and Coven, something fans had eagerly awaited. Michael Langdon, a child hinted to be the Antichrist and born to the Harmon family in Season 1, returned. This time, he was confirmed to be the actual son of Satan, and was opposed by the witches of Season 3. Michael's abbreviated upbringing, during which he aged at a very accelerated rate, features a storyline where he is effectively a child in an adult's body and has to be taught what exactly it means to be the Antichrist and what his duties are in bringing about the end of the world. In the episode Return to Murder House, Anton LaVey and members of the Church of Satan show up at the titular house and perform a human sacrifice as part of a black mass. Anton LaVey was a real person and founder of the Church of Satan, but in real life, the Church of Satan is a secular group that's focused on earthly matters, not actual devil worshippers. LaVey chose the name for metaphorical purposes, and the church is considered an atheist organization. And they don't do sacrifices either. The Church of Satan was upset enough about the show's portrayal to put out a public statement decrying the episode. Along with the witches of Season 3's titular coven, American Horror Story also features several voodoo practitioners of New Orleans, a city known for its connection to the religion. The leader is the voodoo queen, Marie Laveau. She's a cunning immortal who is ruthless in defending herself and her compatriots from witchcraft, a competing magic to voodoo. She'll do anything it takes, and she quickly arises as an antagonist to the witches of Miss Robichaud's academy.
If we don't fight back, we may as well lay down in our beds and wait for death because that's what's at stake.
Marie Laveau was a real person, and she's a legend in the history of New Orleans and voodoo. Practicing her own particular form of magic, Laveau really was known as the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans. She wasn't evil, though. According to an obituary that ran in the New York Times, Laveau was, quote, one of the most wonderful women who ever lived. Obviously, she also wasn't actually immortal, but this rumor predates American Horror Story. It may have come about because her daughter, who was also named Marie Laveau, was also a famous voodoo practitioner who reportedly looked just like her mother. Similar to Freak Show, American Horror Story Cult eschewed supernatural horror for the real-life horrors of cults, brainwashing, and human manipulation. As the story unfolds, there are flashbacks to cult leaders of the recent past. In 1968, a woman named Valerie Solanas attempts to murder artist Andy Warhol and starts a group called SCUM, an acronym for the Society for Cutting Up Men. Solanas and SCUM then begin to commit domestic terror acts to advance their own extremist brand of feminism, culminating in a plot to commit multiple killings and blame them on the Zodiac Killer, a fictionalized persona they created.
These are the Zodiac killings.
Scum killings, actually, but yes.
You're telling me you were the Zodiac Killer?
That's correct.
In reality, Solanas did shoot Andy Warhol, and she did write the SCUM Manifesto, but she never started an actual group. SCUM didn't even stand for anything, despite what people started claiming. While Solanas was mentally unstable, the SCUM Manifesto is typically considered to be hyperbolic and not an actual plan to wipe out men. And there's zero evidence that the Zodiac killings were committed by multiple perpetrators or as part of an organized conspiracy. American Horror Story Coven features a long-standing feud between witches and practitioners of voodoo. As Marie Laveau explains to Fiona Good, voodoo and witchcraft both trace their histories to the Salem witch trials. The first person accused of witchcraft, Tituba, was a slave who practiced a shamanistic magic, an early form of voodoo.
You made her a slave. Before that, she came from a great tribe, the Arawak.
Laveau claims that the white Europeans of Salem learned some of Tituba's magic, then betrayed her, stealing the magic for themselves.
She learned the secrets of the other side from a 2,000-year-old line of shamans, necromancy. She gave it to your girls of Salem.
Historically, the first woman accused of witchcraft in Salem was indeed a slave named Tituba, but that's about all that's correct of Laveau's story. Traditional voodoo is far more closely related to the religious beliefs of West Africa than with the Arawak, the indigenous people of the Caribbean. And it's not even clear that Tituba was of Arawak descent. She was black, but her specific ancestry wasn't recorded, so we don't know her actual heritage at all. What's more, Tituba's accused crimes, which she forcibly confessed to, were all based around European ideas of witchcraft, like riding brooms and having an animal familiar. Of course, it's very likely she didn't practice any sort of magic at all and committed no real crime, like most of the women accused in Salem. One of the lesser-seen antagonists of American Horror Story Coven is Papa Legba, a voodoo Loa with a top hat, painted face, dark clothes, and a tendency to make unsavory deals with mortals. He makes a particularly nasty one with Marie Laveau, requesting that she sacrifice a baby to him once a year to keep her immortality. He's also portrayed as being a warden of hell. Papa Legba exists in voodoo, but the show's depiction is highly inaccurate. His appearance and behavior are derived from a different Loa, Baron Samedi. Papa Legba is meant to be a go-between from mortals to the Loa. Most voodoo rituals involve calling on Papa Legba, a wizened old man with a cane, to carry the practitioner's requests to the Loa, according to Lady Geek Girl. It's also worth noting that hell is not part of voodoo's mythology. Instead, there is a spirit world, which is a counterpart to the human world, but not a place of punishment or fire and brimstone. In voodoo belief, the dead move on to the spirit realm and live there, where they can still be called on by the living. American Horror Story Roanoke was one of the biggest departures for the series. Instead of a traditional narrative, Roanoke presents its story of a haunted house in the form of 2 documentaries. The first, My Roanoke Nightmare, is in the style of a true haunting TV show, with interviews with the homeowners intercut with dramatic reenactments. And the second, Return to Roanoke, 3 Days in Hell, portrays the owners and the actors who played them in a reality show, where both groups are to spend 3 nights together in the house. As the plot unfolds, the source of the horrors of the historical Roanoke colony and the modern haunted house are determined to be caused by a centuries-old witch called Skathek, an Englishwoman of Druidic descent who stowed away on the Roanoke colony ship and was burned at the stake after the colony experienced misfortune. Skathek was freed by ancient gods and slaughtered the people of Roanoke, leading to the events of Roanoke and becoming the first supreme witch, tying into Coven's storyline. Turns out, Skathek is a real mythological entity, but not in American folklore. Instead, she comes from Celtic legends, where she wasn't a witch at all. Skathek was a warrior woman who trained various figures from Celtic mythology in the ways of combat, and was a noble, venerated fighter. The wizarding world of Harry Potter is full of magical creatures, all carefully researched by J.K. Rowling. Well, some are more carefully researched than others. From oversized snakes to underwhelming plants, here are the things Harry Potter got wrong about its mythical beings. One of the first major mythological creatures that Harry, Ron, and Hermione encounter in their adventures is Fluffy, the gigantic 3-headed dog who guards the Sorcerer's Stone. In the end, Fluffy turns out to be pretty lousy at the whole guard dog job because he, or maybe they, immediately falls asleep whenever there's music playing.
Take Fluffy, for example. Just play him a bit of music and he falls straight asleep.
To be fair, his poor job performance is not exactly his fault. He's not the one who decided to put a legendary artifact behind a bunch of whimsical traps that could literally be defeated by a trio of slightly above average children. Anyway, while Fluffy isn't the same creature, he's pretty clearly inspired by the Cerberus, the gigantic 3-headed dog who guards the entrance to the underworld in Greek mythology. On the whole, Cerberus is about as effective at keeping people out of Hades as Fluffy is at keeping people out of the 3rd floor corridor. He is not, however, susceptible to the same weakness. As students of mythology may already know, subduing and capturing Cerberus without using a sword was the last of the famous 12 labors of Hercules, and it didn't go down with a gentle melody from a harp. Instead, legend has it that Herc just beat Cerberus with a rock and then put him in a chokehold until the dog passed out, which is especially impressive when you consider that Cerberus had at least 3 necks. We get a brief glimpse of a truly magical creature in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone when Harry has to serve detention in the Forbidden Forest and catches Voldemort drinking the blood of a slain unicorn. According to Firenze the Centaur, killing a unicorn leaves an indelible stain on one's soul, but the trade-off is that drinking its blood will keep you alive, even if you're hovering on the verge of death.
It is a terrible crime to slay a unicorn. Drinking the blood of a unicorn will keep you alive even if you are an inch from death.
If you know anything about the history of dubious and allegedly magical cures, it won't surprise you to know that people in the past actually did believe that unicorns were real and possessed mystical healing properties. What might come as a surprise, however, is that this was a common belief as recently as the 18th century, and it wasn't the blood that people were interested in. It was, of course, the horns. Powdered unicorn horn was sold by hucksters and conmen in the 17th and 18th centuries as a cure-all for stuff like smallpox, one of the deadliest diseases on Earth. Obviously, it didn't work, and smallpox continued to be a problem until it was officially declared eradicated in 1980 thanks to vaccines, which are a handy thing to have around since unicorns don't technically exist. As for the powder, it could have been virtually anything, but the closest it ever came to being authentic was when it was made from the horns of narwhals. Really, if you didn't know that narwhals were real and unicorns weren't, that would have been pretty darn convincing. Even before Harry gets to Hogwarts in the first book, he encounters goblins, the gold-loving, vaguely sinister beings who run Gringotts Bank. Of course, these guys have since joined the ranks of fantastical creatures who've drawn heavy criticism for bearing a striking similarity to anti-Semitic stereotypes. And folks, there is a heck of a case to be made there. At least the Ferengi from Star Trek and Watto from Star Wars didn't literally run banks. The thing is, they don't exactly match up with the goblins from folklore either. Nowadays, thanks to their appearances in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and their status as a go-to low-level monster in games like Dungeons & Dragons, the word goblin is mostly associated with diminutive, inherently evil creatures. They're the guys who are slightly easier to beat up than orcs, but a little more challenging than kobolds. Originally, however, the word was more like fairy or pixie, a catch-all term for any small magical being that could be friendly or mischievous, depending on the story being told. In fact, rather than the opportunistic bankers we see in Harry Potter, one of the earliest uses of the term refers to a purely benevolent being. The Gesta Romanorum, a collection of folk tales dating back to the late 13th century, contains the appropriately titled story of the benevolent goblin. When parched travelers in a particular area announced, "I thirst," quoting Jesus on the cross, a friendly goblin would emerge, offering the traveler a drink from a golden chalice. Unfortunately, word got out, and an evil knight showed up and stole the chalice, ruining it for everyone. But hey, considering that goblins wanting their artifacts back winds up being a major plot point by the end of the Harry Potter series, maybe that's the origin story for why goblins and wizards don't get along. The basilisk is a legendary animal that dates back to ancient Greece, but in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, one shows up as the key figure in what is probably the most well-crafted whodunit everywhere the answer is a giant snake that none of us have ever seen before. Rowling's basilisk is almost exactly like the mythological one, in that both of them are snakes that have the power to turn their victims to stone simply by looking at them. There is one big difference, though, in a very literal sense. The basilisk in Chamber of Secrets is a huge 60-foot monster whose gigantic venomous fangs can be used in a pinch as a good-sized stabbing dagger. Not so with the mythical one. Pliny the Elder, the human Wikipedia of ancient Rome, described the basilisk as being smaller, only about a foot long, presumably because a snake with superpowers is already pretty scary without being huge. It could be even more off-model, though. The term basilisk is often conflated with another mythical creature with petrifying eyes and a similar origin, the cockatrice. One of the few creatures to show up in both My Little Pony and in the Bible, the cockatrice has the body of a dragon with a head and wings of a rooster. The big snake is more thematically resonant to Harry Potter, but come on, we all know it would have been awesome to see little Daniel Radcliffe trying to fight a big old chicken with dinosaur legs. While it features prominently in Harry's herbology class in Chamber of Secrets, the mandrake plant isn't a made-up magical bit of flora. It's 100% real. And while it's not a sentient being with a cry that can strike you dead where you stand, the fact that its roots usually have a vaguely humanoid shape that gives it a weird resemblance to a baby has cemented its prominent place in folklore. Harry Potter, of course, leans pretty heavily on the more magical side of things, with a particular emphasis on the mandrake's medicinal properties. In the book and movie, it's the main ingredient for curing petrification. But ironically enough, the real-life mandrake, if ingested, can often result in death due to asphyxiation by paralyzing your lungs. It has, however, been historically used as an anesthetic to knock people out for surgeries. And it's also the kind of very powerful hallucinogen that might make you wake up talking about seeing a giant snake even if you've never been to Hogwarts.
Amazing! This is just like magic!
As for how it differs from folklore, well, Harry Potter gets the part about the deadly cry right, but there's also a tradition about how uprooting a mandrake will condemn the uprooter's immortal soul to hell. Considering that Professor Sprout's very first assignment with Mandrake is uprooting and repotting it, she might actually beat Professor Snape in the competition for the teacher who presents the most undeniable danger to the students. If you were going to list the locations in the Harry Potter series by how welcoming and comforting they are, the top entry on your list would likely be the Burrow, the Weasley family's improbable, towering home. It's full of whimsical, magical things like the pesky gnomes out in the garden, the clock that tells you where every member of the very large family is at any given time, the friendly ghoul rattling the pipes, and wait a second, a ghoul?
What are you talking about now?
Funny little green ghouls.
What? Like in movies and cartoons? What?
Little green ghouls, buddy.
Don't write ghouls.
I'm not.
Ghouls have their origins in Middle Eastern folklore. The name comes from the Arabic word, which is often translated as demon but literally means to seize, and were introduced to European audiences with the translation of 1001 Nights into French in 1704. Notably, that version doesn't include friendly pipe rattling, instead focusing on how ghouls are terrifying creatures who dwell in desolate places and cemeteries, where they feast on corpses, drink blood, and occasionally lure children to their doom. Molly Weasley is generally depicted as a good mother who only wants the best for her family, but keeping a flesh-eating super zombie around is probably not a great way to raise children, even if you have 4 or 5 spares. Then again, this is the same family that let a mass murderer live in their youngest son's bedroom for a solid decade without knowing it. They're still better than the Dursleys, but maybe not as much as we thought. First introduced in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, the Boggarts are easily one of the coolest ideas to show up in the Potter series. They're all-purpose monsters from your childhood nightmares, formless creatures that take the shape of what you're most afraid of, hiding under the bed or in the closet. It's a great way of taking an idea so familiar to its younger audience and making it a part of the magical world. When you get right down to it, Boggart is as good a name as any, since its modern usage, like boogeyman, is a generic term for any malevolent spirit causing trouble around the house. Historically, though, a boggart was a specific creature from British mythology. According to 1851's Dialect and Folklore of Northamptonshire, one boggart was described as, quote, a squat hairy man, strong as a 6-year-old horse, and with arms almost as long as tackle poles. That's a pretty definitive shape, but maybe the person doing the describing was just really afraid of Wario and Waluigi. And really, who isn't? If you're mostly familiar with elves as Santa's singing, toy-making helpers, or J.R.R. Tolkien's beautiful immortals, here's something that might blow your mind. From a folkloric standpoint, J.K. Rowling's elves might actually be her most accurate additions to the wizarding world. Rowling's elves are direct descendants from one of the most famous fairy tales collected by the Brothers Grimm in the 1800s, which is probably best known to English-speaking audiences as The Elves and the Shoemaker. It's a familiar story, but in case you don't know it, it's about a poor shoemaker who's down to his last scrap of cash, who's helped by a pair of elves who cheerfully craft a fine pair of shoes that save his business. They continue to work for him for a while, until, flush with cash, the shoemaker and his wife buy the elves some fine sets of miniature clothing, leaving them out as a thank you present. The elves get the clothes, and they stop making shoes because they finally have something of their own.
Master has presented Dobby with clothes. Dobby is free.
So, yeah, in the original story, the elves are just straight up buck naked the entire time. That is often left out of the story, for the obvious reason that nobody wants to read or make a fanciful cartoon for children about 2 elves who are just hanging their broomstick and bludgers out while doing some leatherworking and intensely punishing themselves. Needless to say, Rowling left that bit out too, dressing her unclothed elves in tea towels and pillowcases. The other big difference? In the original story, the elves are happy to be freed, and they're never depicted as being extremely stoked about remaining as what are essentially slaves, like some of Rowling's elves.